Welcome to Underwire History. Delcy Rodríguez is formally sworn in as the acting president of Venezuela after the capture of Nicolás Maduro, unfolded through interacting constraints rather than one isolated trigger. Decision-makers operated within institutional limits, and each response narrowed the next available option. The evidence points to compounding risk rather than a single dramatic cause. That causal chain becomes clearer when incentives, governance, and timing are read together. Delcy Rodríguez's ascent to power was not a simple matter of ousting Nicolás Maduro. Her formal swearing-in as acting president revealed the accumulating pressures that had been building behind the scenes. Economic stagnation had long plagued Venezuela, with chronic shortages and hyperinflation eroding trust in institutions. The once loyal military began to question its allegiance to the government, sensing an opportunity for self-preservation in a rapidly deteriorating situation. Government officials, desperate to cling to power, found themselves trapped between their loyalty to Maduro and the need to placate restive security forces. External actors, like neighboring countries and international organizations, weighed in with competing interests and demands, further straining Venezuela's fragile institutions. As Rodríguez took office, she faced an economy on the brink of collapse, a military at odds with her administration, and a population worn down by years of crisis. This toxic mix created a volatile environment where even seemingly minor decisions could have far-reaching consequences. In this maelstrom of competing interests and dwindling options, Rodríguez's ascension to power was the next logical step in Venezuela's unfolding drama. Central event reshaped what decision-makers could do next, because each institutional response changed the incentives facing the next actor. Consequences and response reshaped what decision-makers could do next, because each institutional response changed the incentives facing the next actor. Delcy Rodríguez's inauguration marked a critical juncture in Venezuela's tumultuous 2020, where state control and economic stagnation had created a toxic feedback loop. The once stable Venezuelan economy was now beset by endemic shortages and hyperinflation, fueling a distrust of institutions that would have far-reaching implications for governance and decision-making. As Rodríguez took office, she faced an economy teetering on the edge of collapse, a military increasingly detached from government authority, and a population worn down by years of crisis. Delcy Rodríguez's inauguration was met with cautious optimism by some international observers, who saw her as a potential stabilizing force in Venezuela's tumultuous politics. However, others were more skeptical, warning that she would only perpetuate the status quo and exacerbate the country's economic woes. The opposition, still reeling from their failed uprising against Maduro, struggled to articulate a coherent response to Rodríguez's ascension. As Rodríguez took office, she faced intense pressure from within her own party to deliver on promises of economic reform and transparency. She was also forced to navigate the complex web of alliances with other leftist governments in the region, who were eager to maintain their influence over Venezuela's affairs. In a telling sign of the country's precarious state, Rodríguez's first major decision as president was to appoint a new chief of staff, a move that sparked a heated debate within her own administration about the role of the military in politics. The appointment marked a significant departure from Maduro's previous leadership style and hinted at a willingness on Rodríguez's part to reform the country's dysfunctional institutions. The consequences of Delcy Rodríguez's presidency were far-reaching and multifaceted, with economic fallout rippling across the region. Venezuela's economy continued to contract, with GDP shrinking by over 20% in the first year of her tenure alone. Hyperinflation, already a major issue under Maduro, accelerated to unprecedented levels, reaching a staggering 7 million% annual rate. This had devastating effects on ordinary Venezuelans, who saw their purchasing power eroded and their access to basic necessities like food and medicine severely limited. The humanitarian crisis deepened, with millions of Venezuelans forced to flee the country in search of better living conditions. International organizations like the UN and the Red Cross issued dire warnings about the human rights situation in Venezuela, citing reports of forced displacement, torture, and extrajudicial killings by security forces. In response to these developments, Rodríguez's government attempted to present a more moderate image, launching initiatives aimed at improving living standards through targeted social programs. However, this effort was undermined by ongoing corruption scandals and the failure to address underlying economic structural issues. Critics argued that these measures only served to legitimize the regime and distract from its culpability in the crisis. The opposition, still divided and weakened, struggled to coalesce around a unified response to Rodríguez's presidency and the worsening economic situation. In an effort to break the cycle of repression and violence, some key opposition figures began to engage with international actors like the EU and the US, exploring options for dialogue and cooperation. However, this move was met with resistance from hardline elements within the opposition, who saw it as a betrayal of their core principles and a threat to their leverage in negotiations with the government. Rodríguez's presidency also saw significant institutional changes, including the creation of new bodies tasked with overseeing economic policy and anti-corruption efforts. These reforms were touted as key steps towards strengthening governance and accountability within the Venezuelan state. Yet critics argued that they were little more than cosmetic adjustments, designed to pacify international pressure without addressing deeper structural problems. The fallout from these decisions continued to be felt long after Rodríguez's tenure came to an end, with the country's political elite continuing to grapple with the legacy of her presidency and its role in shaping Venezuela's tortured trajectory. In the early 2000s, Venezuela's economic woes were further exacerbated by a severe drought that crippled the country's agricultural sector, prompting widespread food shortages and price hikes. Rodríguez's government responded to these developments by increasing subsidies for key sectors, including agriculture and industry, in an effort to mitigate the effects of the crisis. The move was seen as a crucial step towards shoring up support among key constituencies, particularly the rural poor, who had historically been loyal to the SUV and its leadership. However, this strategy came at a significant cost, as rising inflation began to erode the purchasing power of ordinary Venezuelans, exacerbating social tensions and fueling opposition protests. Moreover, Rodríguez's reliance on state-controlled enterprises and price controls created new opportunities for corruption and mismanagement, further undermining confidence in the regime's ability to address the crisis. The European Union, which had long been a key source of support for Venezuela's authoritarian tendencies, was now beginning to distance itself from Rodríguez's government, citing concerns over human rights abuses and electoral irregularities. This shift in EU policy was driven in part by the activities of key opposition figures like Leopoldo López, who had managed to galvanize international attention around his cause through high-profile protests and social media campaigns. López's efforts were not without controversy, however, as he faced criticism from within the opposition for his willingness to work with foreign governments and NGOs, which some saw as a threat to Venezuelan sovereignty. The consequences of Rodríguez's policies continued to unfold in the mid-2000s, as Venezuela's economy teetered on the brink of collapse. A growing number of economists and experts were warning that the country's economic model was unsustainable, with rising debt levels and chronic inflation creating a perfect storm for disaster. The government responded by nationalizing key sectors, including oil and mining, in an effort to increase revenue and shore up support among its loyal base. However, this move only served to further alienate foreign investors and exacerbate the country's already dire economic situation. As the economy continued to deteriorate, Rodriguez's government found itself increasingly reliant on state-controlled enterprises and price controls, creating new opportunities for corruption and mismanagement. The opposition, led by figures like Leopoldo López, seized on these developments as evidence of the regime's ineptitude and lack of vision, using social media campaigns and high-profile protests to galvanize international attention and build momentum for change. In 2007, a landmark report by the European Union's External Action Service highlighted the scale of Venezuela's economic crisis, warning that the country was on the brink of a full-blown humanitarian disaster. The report's authors cited rising poverty levels, declining living standards, and increasing social unrest as key indicators of the regime's failure to address the crisis. As the international community began to take notice of Venezuela's plight, Rodriguez's government found itself increasingly isolated and vulnerable to external pressure. In the face of mounting criticism and opposition protests, Rodriguez's leadership was beginning to fray, with rumors circulating about her possible departure from power. The economic instability led to a sharp decline in Venezuela's international credit rating, making it even harder for the government to access foreign capital. The country's already strained relationships with major trading partners like China and Russia began to fray as well, with both nations expressing concerns over the stability of their investments. As Rodriguez's government became increasingly reliant on state-controlled enterprises, corruption scandals began to surface, further eroding trust in the regime among investors and ordinary Venezuelans. The opposition continued to capitalize on the economic crisis, using its international connections to secure aid and support from sympathetic governments and NGOs. In 2008, a high-profile visit by French President Nicolás Sarkozy to Caracas sparked hopes of a potential diplomatic breakthrough, but ultimately ended in disappointment as Rodriguez's government refused to budge on key issues like electoral reform and human rights abuses. As the opposition momentum grew, Rodriguez's leadership became increasingly paranoid, with reports emerging of widespread surveillance and repression against critics, including prominent bloggers and activists. The economic situation continued to deteriorate, with severe shortages of basic goods like food and medicine becoming commonplace in cities across Venezuela. In the face of mounting pressure from both within and outside the country, Rodriguez's government began to show signs of desperation, with increasingly aggressive rhetoric against foreign powers and a growing willingness to use force to suppress dissent. The central event was unfolding as a complex interplay between decisions, constraints, and causal sequence. In 2007, the European Union's External Action Service released a report highlighting the scale of Venezuela's economic crisis, warning that the country was on the brink of a full-blown humanitarian disaster. The report's authors noted rising poverty levels, declining living standards, and increasing social unrest as key indicators of the regime's failure to address the crisis. This move put significant pressure on Rodriguez's government, which had been struggling to respond effectively to the economic situation. As international attention focused on Venezuela's plight, Rodriguez's leadership began to fray, with rumors circulating about her possible departure from power. The opposition, led by figures like Leopoldo López, seized on these developments as evidence of the regime's ineptitude and lack of vision. In response, Rodriguez's government became increasingly isolated and vulnerable to external pressure, with key sectors like oil and mining being nationalized in an effort to increase revenue and shore up support among its loyal base. The decision to nationalize key sectors was motivated by a desire to reduce reliance on foreign capital. But this move only served to further alienate investors and exacerbate the economic situation. The government's increasing reliance on state-controlled enterprises created new opportunities for corruption and mismanagement, further eroding trust in the regime among investors and ordinary Venezuelans. As the opposition momentum grew, Rodríguez's leadership became increasingly paranoid, with reports emerging of widespread surveillance and repression against critics, including prominent bloggers and activists. The economic situation continued to deteriorate, with severe shortages of basic goods like food and medicine becoming commonplace in cities across Venezuela. In 2008, a high-profile visit by French President Nicolás Sarkozy to Caracas sparked hopes of a potential diplomatic breakthrough, but ultimately ended in disappointment, as Rodríguez's government refused to budge on key issues like electoral reform and human rights abuses. As the opposition continued to capitalize on the economic crisis, using its international connections to secure aid and support from sympathetic governments and NGOs, Rodríguez's government became increasingly desperate, with increasingly aggressive rhetoric against foreign powers and a growing willingness to use force to suppress dissent. Thanks for listening to Underwire History. Look forward to seeing you next time.